Hi everybody, thank you for joining us for the Charity People Leadership Series today. And today we're joined by Carla Miller and we'll be talking about women in leadership. Hi Carla.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Did you want to just briefly introduce yourself, Carla, and tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure, yes. So hi everyone, my name's Carla Miller. I'm a leadership coach and I focus on working with women and empowering them in their careers. I'm also the host of a chart-topping podcast called the Influence and Impact Podcast, and I'm writing a book at the moment on the same topic. And I'm also the founder of the Influence and Impact program for female leaders. So that keeps me busy. And before that, I was a fundraising director for many years. I've been chief exec of a charity, and I was also actually managing director of Charity People for a year or so, about 5 or 6 years back. So I love things like this because I just think it's so important to support the sector in the way that you're doing. So thank you.
It's great to have you here. In fact, I was just having a look at your podcast earlier on, and there's just so much content in there, which is, great for anybody obviously following today's session to jump on to get a bit more information about what you do. And given, so obviously your background's quite varied, but you've had the opportunity to work directly in the charity sector in your fundraising role and CEO position. And I think, that will probably give you really great insight into sort of female leadership in the charity sector specifically. In your opinion, do you think that there are barriers for women who are looking for leadership positions in the charity sector?
I think there absolutely are, but they're quite subtle because we do see plenty of women at the top of charities. About 2/3 of employees in the charity sector are women, but only about 1/4 of chief execs in the charity sector are women. So we do struggle to get into those top levels of leadership. There's a pay gap as well. So in terms of chief execs, men get paid on average 12% more at chief exec level. And in fundraising, generally men get paid 14% more than women in the sector do. So there clearly is some issues there, even though it is a sector that's obviously very committed to equality and diversity, there's still a long way to go. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of that is just society. The world of work generally is not set up for us, is it? It wasn't created by women. It was created by men who had someone at home who was doing the housework and looking after the children and the dogs and all of that stuff. Whilst we're obviously multitasking and doing both a lot of the time. I think working policies as well. So things like shared parental leave, flexible working, we're starting to see some improvements in that, but the charity sector isn't the best sector for those kind of things as far as I can see. And then there's that unconscious bias. So there's things like the fact that we're all drawn to people who are like us, and we all want to promote and develop people that are like us. And because there's more men at the top of organizations, they don't realize that there is bias when they are drawn to promoting men over women. They often think that there's a really logical reason for that to do with skills and experience, but you can't actually account for the unconscious bias that's there. And then I think that adds to some of the self-doubt that women feel. So I work with mainly middle and senior managers, and outwardly they seem super confident, but internally there's a lot of self-doubt there. There's a lot of imposter feelings. And I think that a lot of that is exacerbated by the fact we're still working within a workplace where we feel like fundamentally we don't belong. So I think there's lots of challenges. And then COVID set women back a lot because it was generally women that were taking on most of those childcare responsibilities when we were homeschooling. And so I think the progress that was made has taken a bit of a step back recently.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I think, just thinking about sort of the recruitment that we do at Charity People as well, I think my observation is it is quite a female dominated sector within certain roles. But then as you sort of start to move towards those top tier roles, whether they are the CEO or other executive positions or even positions on the board, it's at that point that you start to see that, that sort of there isn't as much opportunity for females. And so, I think it's interesting sort of how that sort of happens. And I think some of the things that you've sort of touched upon there are, like you say, it's very subtle as to why it does happen, and it can be quite sort of challenging, I think, to create almost a bit of a culture change there.
Absolutely. And I think it's about being aware of it. Like if you had asked me that question 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said, well, no, I've got to the top. There are no barriers. And obviously things are more straightforward for someone who's been university educated, who's white, who's straight.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking about women in general, but obviously there are groups within that, subsections within that, where there are additional discrimination. There's additional discrimination that they're facing. So that's particularly hard. It's particularly hard for Black women to get their voice heard, for example, without being seen as aggressive. And you don't see many female leaders who are women of colour. I recently interviewed someone about that, and they have been in the charity sector for years. And they said it was many, many years before they saw anybody who looked like them in a room of senior people. And I was really shocked by that, because no one had shone a light on it for me. When she said it, I was like, going through all the rooms I've been in and thinking she's completely right. There are very few women of colour, for example, in leadership roles.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think sort of the sector can be doing to ensure that there is more opportunity for, I guess, women in our underrepresented communities?
I think that's a great question. I think the first thing is understanding that bias is there. I also think it's about making sure that they've got the development opportunities, making sure that women have the opportunity to present, to speak, are asked for their opinions in meetings. I think quite often a few dominant voices take over. I also think we can champion each other as women. So if someone interrupts me, it's very hard for me to tackle that without seeming like I'm being defensive or aggressive or making a big deal over it. But someone else in the room, another woman in the room, could say, actually, I'd really like to hear what Carla had to say. So we can actively champion our peers as well. And I think investing in coaching, leadership development, having networks within charities, women's networks, diversity and equality networks, and teaching people how to be allies can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's something that almost we think is given, but it's not always, and something that we all kind of need to be aware of, that we're helping each other along with this stuff.
Absolutely. Just having the conversations, like we're all learning. I'm still learning. I still don't know what language to use. I still feel uncomfortable talking about things. However, it's being prepared as leaders to do that, to have those conversations and to give people a voice that don't have enough of a voice at the moment.
Definitely. And so sort of thinking about then kind of the barriers to actually gaining the leadership position. So you've got that one set of challenges. What about then sort of when somebody moves into a leadership position? I mean, do similar issues spill over from one to the other, or is it a case of that we're faced with a whole other set of challenges at that point?
I think there's similar issues, but for me, it comes down to the fact that work is, in a way, it's a bit of a game, but no one writes down the rules for you. And men just seem to know the rules better than we do. And so for me, I realized there was a big gap around influencing skills that I developed myself, and now I support other women with, because you need to be able to speak the language of senior stakeholders. You also need to be able to be confident in your own leadership style, rather than looking at the people around you, whether they're men or just women who have different styles to you, and thinking I should be like them, and then feeling rubbish because you're kind of faking it. I encourage people to really work out what kind of leader they want to be and how they want to be perceived, and get intentional about that. So I think that can be helpful. I obviously think learning influencing skills can be helpful, so you can navigate internally. And personally, I'm a big fan of personal development. So that inner critic voice we all have that's really negative can hold us back hugely. It can stop us making that point that's really good in a meeting, but we're worried we're going to be judged for it, so we never actually get it out. Or it can enable us, it can stop us from challenging, because we think, well, who are we to challenge that decision that's been made, when actually we're really well placed to challenge that decision that's been made. So I find that the best leaders have done some of that self-development to deal with some of those inner gremlins, inner critic, that can hold us back as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's lots of our viewers that can definitely identify with those thoughts and feelings. And I think you make a really good point about leadership style. In fact, I was reading as well that sort of one of the things and challenges that women have to face is that we're often sort of taught to be more like men in our leadership style rather than just actually being a woman, being a female leader and being okay with that. It's almost like we have to take on almost masculine qualities in some way that perhaps go against our nature, when really there's so many other qualities that females can bring to a leadership position.
That's a really interesting point. I've just read a book called Why Men Win at Work, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in this topic. And it says it's really hard because if we try and act like men, actually we get judged for that. So if a man interrupts someone else, everyone thinks he has something really valuable to say. When a woman does it, we're actually seen as aggressive. And an angry man will get promoted, an angry woman will get demoted. It's fascinating. So, but also authenticity resonates with people. So when we're trying to be like someone else, it's really hard to make genuine connections and get respect and influence because we're faking it. So one of the theories in the book is that Hillary Clinton, one of the reasons she didn't do well is because she was trying to lead like a man rather than actually embracing the woman that she is. But there was some really interesting research came out during lockdown from, I think it was from Deloitte actually, about the leadership traits that organizations needed to thrive in that time of huge uncertainty. And they were things like compassion and empathy and adaptability. And it was like, these are all the traits that many women have been bringing to the table for a long time. And those traits have been dismissed because they weren't traditional masculine leadership traits. So I think that's really interesting.
Definitely. And I think sort of the next question actually that was going to ask actually really does relate to the pandemic and I guess the press coverage around how the pandemic's actually been managed by female leaders and how they've done that so successfully. Do you think that women tend to manage crisis situations better, or what's your sort of view on that?
It would be tempting to say yes, but I think caveats around why. You know, I'm a big fan of Jacinda Ardern. She's done in New Zealand, but New Zealand is a very different place and a different situation to the UK, which is obviously a global hub, for example. However, there's been some research done by Gallup where they spoke to employees, and it was established that women are much better at bringing the best out in their team and engaging their team. And Goldman Sachs has done research that says teams that are diverse make better decisions and are more profitable. So for me, rather than try and argue that women are better than men, I like to argue that diversity helps everybody, and let's recognize the strengths that different individuals bring to the table. And obviously women aren't all the same and men aren't all the same, but there are certain traits that a lot of women have, like empathy, for example, which society has encouraged us to have. So men may just have as much empathy, but they were never encouraged when they were younger to be empathetic in the same way as we were. So I hate mass generalizations, but you obviously end up making some of those about women's leadership.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've been really pleased to see is that there's definitely sort of a move towards having gender parity on executive teams, so that real balance, so that there is sort of mutual qualities, and that organisations can benefit from having the great qualities of women and the great qualities of men in their leadership team. Which I think, as you'd said earlier, there's still a long way to go, but it's really nice to sort of see and observe that things are moving in that direction, and that there's certainly an appetite to have that and an awareness of it as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the FTSE 100, they have targets that they have to reach of women at particular levels. We don't have that in our sector, but I think what would be really interesting is to see a lot more of the pay equality surveys, so looking at gender equality when it comes to pay, and also race equality when it comes to pay, because I think when you actually look at the statistics, well, then you can't ignore what's happening. Whilst when you don't have statistics, we rely on our own stories and our own narrative, which are just from our own perspectives, and the decision makers are quite a narrow group at the moment, so their perspective is quite narrow.
I think you're right, and I think those statistics are so revealing It's kind of the facts, isn't it, which really people can't sort of shy away from. So I think that transparency is definitely really important. What advice would you give, Carla, to sort of our next generation of female leaders?
I love that question. I think the first piece of advice I would give is take control of your own career. I think when I was first becoming a leader, you basically sat there and waited for someone to send you on a course, or to tell you what your next development move was, or to tell you you were ready for a promotion. Hopefully times are changing now, but I would encourage women to think about what they want to achieve, to ask for what they want, and to invest in their own development. Charity sector training budgets get smaller and smaller all the time. I think it's one of the first things to be cut. But there are lots of things out there that you can fund yourself. So if you know where you want to get to, don't sit there feeling disempowered. Instead, plan for your own development. So that would be my first point. My second point would be to build a network, whether that's a network of peers or a network including mentors and sponsors. So mentors are quite well known within the UK, and that's someone who's done a job that you want to do and can share their advice with you. Sponsorship is a concept that's come across from the States, and it's relatively new over here, I think. Perhaps it's common in the bigger companies, but certainly not in the charity sector. And it's more proactive than that. So if you're looking for a sponsor in your organization, it's a woman, I mean, it could be a man as well, but it's someone in a senior position that will champion you, that will advocate for you, that will make sure that others can see how fantastic you are. That is incredibly valuable. So build your network, and then identify the gaps that you've got and find ways of filling those. And they might be gaps in terms of technical skills around strategy, for example, or project management, or they might be some of those softer skills. And the three that I see a lot in terms of women needing to work on, and that's why I've ended up working in these areas, are confidence and self-doubt, so believing in yourself, increasing your impact, so finding ways to get your voice heard, not doing yourself down in the way that you're communicating. So lots of people will start sentences by saying, I might be wrong, but, or sorry, but. And so I teach people other more empowering phrases to use. So increasing your impact, getting your voice heard, and then finally influencing skills, because you have to be able to speak the language of those senior stakeholders to be able to get them to take you seriously and to take the needs of your team seriously. So those are the things that I would encourage. And as you can see, I love books, and there are loads of amazing books out there. So next year, buy my book. But meanwhile, there's some great books out there.
There are. And I think, that advice is brilliant. Probably one thing I would ask you, actually, just sort of leading on from that as well, because as people are sort of thinking about where the gaps are and, these different proactive steps that they can take, how do they balance these things with being really busy, maybe being a parent? There's so much to be done. I mean, how do you fit it all in, kind of thing? Is there any advice there?
Great question. Firstly, I would ask your employer for some time to spend on your own development. Ask for the money. If they can't give you the money, well, then can you give me some time? Because this is about me becoming even more impactful in my job. Secondly, there are lots of bite-sized things you can do. So I do like short, free masterclasses that 45 minutes long, have a few hundred people on those every month. So that, and I'm definitely not the only one doing those. There are plenty of great people out there doing that. And there are things you can do in the evening as well. But I would say, rather than joining a million different things or trying to read a million different books, maybe each quarter think, well, this is the one area I'd like to improve my skills in, and I'm going to do something to improve on that this quarter, and then something else the quarter afterwards. Your career is a marathon, not a sprint, and you don't have to be perfect to be promotable, and you don't need every qualification under the sun in order to be promotable as well. I think often as women, we think, well, we'll apply for that when we've got some extra qualification, got extra experience, but actually often that's us holding ourselves back rather than the actual situation holding ourselves back.
Definitely. I think I even notice that sometimes when people will say that they won't apply for something because they just don't tick everything on the job description. So it does hold them back from applying, and it often can take sort of, one of our team saying, no, you've got all the skills, you've got the experience, just apply. So it's an interesting point that you make there.
It's
And
interesting. Sorry, I was
sorry.
just going to say, I've got a client now, and I actually met her when I was at Charity People, and she had come from the commercial sector and she wanted to move into the charity sector, and she was looking at starting at the bottom, and she had these incredible skills. And I was like, go and do the course at CAS. I can't remember what CAS is called now. I think it's changed its name. But go and do a course to learn the sector, because I think you could go in at chief exec level. And that's exactly what she did. And she's been incredibly effective. But she said that one meeting that just showed me that I wasn't believing in myself enough, because you were looking at me and my CV and believing in me, and that made me think it was possible. So recruitment consultants play a great role in that, even when we don't realize we're doing it.
Oh yeah, we're always doing it. I think kind of have to, don't you, in such a sort of, candidate short sector as well. Encouraging people to come into the sector, I think, is really important, particularly coming from other areas. But yeah, I think, like you say, I think that encouragement, I mean, we've all been encouraged at different points of our career, and I think you're always really grateful to those people who sort of gave you that shove. So it's a really good point. And I really like your podcast series is really varied as well. So when I was looking at it earlier, I actually thought this is great, because you could just listen to one a month and it's on a specific area and you'd get a lot out of it. So again, as you'd said, just focusing on one specific area, I think is really achievable. But I think your podcast series does actually sort of play into that a little bit as well.
It does. I mean, they used to be really short, and then I get a bit carried away now.
Yeah.
So when I first started, they were 20 minutes, and now they're longer.
Yeah.
But I try and use it as a way of teaching some bite-sized information, but also having those discussions other people aren't having. So we've talked about women of colour, we've talked about menopause, we talked about fertility treatment, talked about neurodiversity. I mean, we haven't even touched on menopause and fertility treatment here in terms of some of the barriers that we face. But now we're also starting to see more organisations that are menopause friendly, and there's a menopause friendly accreditation. There's a whole load of women, so I'm in my mid-40s now, there's a whole load of women my age and the 10 years ahead of me that have been suffering in silence for a long time, because employers haven't acknowledged or made any adjustments to help. And working from home has been hugely helpful, but when people are all back in the office, things need to start to change there as well.
Definitely, I agree. And actually, even at Charity People, we have sort of a women's group, and we've been having this conversation as well. These almost sort of this stuff needs to be put in the spotlight, and conversations need to start sort of happening that have just never happened before. But again, it's sort of like a culture change, isn't it, really? But it's great to see that that the conversations are at least starting to happen. We may have a long way to go yet, but I think it's and as you say, some things have just never been talked about in the workplace as well, like menopause. It's just sort of great to see that people are feeling comfortable about having those conversations.
Absolutely. And I think, as you were talking, what I just was reflecting on in my head is that the charity sector is a great place for opportunities. I did incredibly well in my career because I had so many opportunities, because everything's under-resourced, your teams are smaller, organizations are smaller, and you can try lots of different things. So there's huge potential there. I think it's just about trying to make sure that everybody gets those opportunities, and really championing other women as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Carla, for joining us. It's been really informative, just to hear your insight. And obviously a massive thank you to everybody else as well for tuning in today.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you.